and historians to watch. They would monitor the content of dissertations and theses, articles and monographs, and of course more informal conversations, even the private lives of academics. Needless to say, the practice of departmental colleagues informing on each other to security services was widespread. Perhaps a part of academic culture to, in other universities they simply informed the dean. But back then they would inform the security services. So the Polish self-concept, they describe the American self-concept being based on this historically determined idea of freedom. The Polish self-concept is also based on the historical notion of freedom, but understood quite differently from the American sense of freedom, as the Polish sense is a defense against external tyranny. The Dean of American Historians of Poland, Dekaban2010-Part3.flv, aptly titled his History of East Central Europe, The Price of Freedom. In the 19th century, Poles fought for the liberation of other lands under the slogan, "For your freedom and ours." Two major historical experiences have shaped modern Polish identity and culture. The first of these is the partitions, and this is obvious if anyone who has studied Polish history understands the sort of salience of the partitions and how throughout much of the past 200 years, if you got two Poles together, they'd have a debate about what went wrong and when the partitions could have been prevented. I've had debates with that, some of my friends even in the 21st century. The other is the Second World War. Of these two, the war is arguably much more important for contemporary Polish identity, and no aspect of the war is more important than the Warsaw Uprising. The uprising began on August 1st, 1944, a warm summer day in German-occupied Warsaw. Despite an advance by Soviet troops to the east of the city, Nazi forces were firmly in control and prepared to defend Warsaw, its key bridges and railroad junctions. For almost 5 years, Poland's capital of over 1 million people had been under an inhuman occupation regime. Its Jewish population had been herded into a walled ghetto and systematically murdered by starvation, disease, transportation to the gas chambers of Treblinka. About 28,000 Jews, less than a tenth of the city's original Jewish community, remained hidden within the Christian population. The Gentile majority had been subject to a reign of terror unlike any of that in occupied Europe. Mass executions, arrests and torture of leading citizens and suspected resistance activists, random street roundups that took tens of thousands of concentration camps and slave labor, destruction and looting of libraries, museums, and archives, systematic and brutal suppression of any expression of non-German life. At about 5 p.m. on August the 1st, shots rang out across the city as an army of 45,000 citizen soldiers of the underground Armia Krajowa, or Home Army, AK, I use the Polish abbreviation AK, emerged from hiding and attacked Nazi installations around Warsaw. With Soviet forces only days away and Soviet radio urging Poles to rise up against the hated Germans, the AK launched Operation Tempest to liberate the city ahead of the Red Army, beginning the largest urban uprising in history. After the outbreak of the uprising, under orders from Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin, Soviet forces halted their advance outside of the city, giving Nazi commanders a chance to regroup and bring in massive reinforcements. An enraged Adolf Hitler ordered the total extermination of Warsaw's over 1 million inhabitants and the city's complete physical destruction. In addition to tanks, artillery, including massive siege mortars, dive bombers, and elite SS and airborne forces, German commanders unleashed units made up of convicts made for their own military prisons, murderers, rapists, child molesters, thieves, and formations of Red Army deserters of the city's civilian population. Insurgent forces had no heavy weapons, and only 1 in 10 AK fighters had a weapon in hand on August the 1st. For 63 days, the citizen soldiers of the AK, supported by the civilian population, fought the full might of the Third Reich. Units made up of Boy Scouts and Girl Guides, armed with a variety of hand-captured and homemade weapons, fought house to house, room to room with SS stormtroopers. Nazi forces committed mass murder throughout the campaign, slaughtering their way through civilian areas outside the battle zone. The savagery of the rape, torture, and murder committed by some of the Nazi penal units sickened even hardened SS officers. Nevertheless, units skilled at massacring civilians had a tougher task facing armed citizens. For example, on August 20th, insurgent forces assaulted the well-fortified State Telephone Exchange Building, one of Warsaw's few skyscrapers. Sapper units made up of teenage girls led the attack, detonating home improvised explosives in the lower floors, driving the SS defenders into the upper parts of the building. Then units armed with homemade flamethrowers set the building alight, forcing the defenders to die fighting their way out of the trap, surrender, or commit suicide. Throughout the campaign, German forces stormed buildings during the day, only to lose them to fierce counterattacks at night. Despite inflicting heavy losses on the German forces, the Poles were forced back into an ever-shrinking perimeter as Warsaw burned around them. Ignoring the protests of Allied leaders, the Soviets refused to provide support for the OUK and denied the use of Soviet air bases for American Allied planes attempting to drop supplies to the insurgents. As a result, volunteer Allied air crews, American, British, Polish, and South African, had to complete a dangerous round-trip flight from Italy, from which many did not return. In fact, Norman Davies, in his book on the Warsaw Uprising, actually documents some cases where Soviet fighters actually attacked Allied supply aircraft flying to Warsaw. On October the 2nd, Home Army troops, having been granted the status of uniformed combatants under the Geneva Convention, accepted a German offer to lay down their arms. German shelling and bombing, the extermination of orders of Nazi commanders, resulted in the deaths of over 200,000 civilians. On Hitler's orders, the remainder of Warsaw was systematically burned and dynamited. By January 1945, 85% of the city's buildings were demolished, including nearly every single structure of historical cultural significance. The uprising became a watershed event in modern Polish history for a couple of reasons. First was both the heroism of the citizenry of Warsaw and the sheer scale of the atrocities and catastrophic losses, both human and physical, that the Poles endured. Although serious people may yet debate the decision to launch an uprising, the fact remains that a whole generation of Poles had willingly laid down their lives for their freedom and the freedom of their country. This struggle had taken place in Poland's capital city, and the world had watched as Hitler's minions slaughtered its people and turned one of the most beautiful cities in Central Europe into a field of rubble, while the Red Army stood aside and did nothing to help. Second, and most importantly, while the uprising had been aimed militarily at the Nazis, it was aimed politically at the Soviets. Stalin's decision to allow his erstwhile Nazi allies to get rid of Poland's non-communist resistance movement resulted in a faster Soviet takeover of Poland, but also ensured that Soviet rule and the rule of his Polish communist henchmen would never be secure. Even without the rising, the Poles were strongly opposed to communism and loathed the Soviets on many levels. The uprising ensured that the war itself, from a Polish perspective, would become defined as much by the struggle against Stalin as against Hitler. From the communist perspective, this was ideologically dangerous and greatly complicated consolidation of power in Poland, since the entire justification for Soviet post-war expansion into East Central Europe was founded on the myth of the, quote, Great Patriotic War, in which the heroic Red Army had, quote, liberated the fraternal peoples of East Central Europe from the Hitlerite menace, as well as from the native bourgeois element who were conveniently labeled fascist collaborators. The Soviet invasion of 1939, the mass executions and deportations of the first Soviet occupation, which lasted until 1941, Katyn, the Soviet assault on the Polish underground from 1943 onward, the extreme brutality of the post-war occupation, and most of all, the Warsaw Uprising robbed the communists of their most important ideological tool. Thus, even while the uprising was underway, the communists sought to redefine it and reconfigure its historical significance. It became a, quote, nationalist, fascist, criminal enterprise. After the war, the communist puppet regime amplified this theme by recategorizing the entire Polish struggle against Nazism as a, quote-unquote, fascist, pro-Nazi effort. This went hand in hand with violent persecution of former underground activists and heroes. And leaders of this persecution was very well. I'll give you a couple of examples of the most prominent. This persecution was against pretty much everyone who had been associated with the underground, and it varied in intensity. But the leaders of the non-communist independentist resistance movement were persecuted and murdered by the Polish communist and Soviet authorities. Among them were men such as August Emil Fieldorf, who directed the Home Army's resistance and sabotage campaign that wreaked havoc on Nazi supply lines to the Eastern Front. They blew up scores of trains carrying supplies that probably in fact saved the lives of quite a few Red Army soldiers.